thanks so much for joining us today. I'm so excited to be joined by Michelle Stone, who is an accredited online business manager. We're going to find out more about that. But first, I was so excited that Michelle was joining us because she is the first veteran spouse that we have. Her husband is medically retired. And, before anybody comments that I'm being highly insensitive, everything I'm bringing up, Michelle and I have already discussed and she's comfortable talking about. So this is not a gotcha kind of interview. We've already had a conversation in the green room. And so I just appreciate, Michelle, that you're willing to shed some light on what it's like to be a caregiver and a professional military spouse and the challenges and opportunities. And I just appreciate you joining us for the conversation. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
No, this is going to be fun. And so we're talking about and that's the puppy that is in the background, and you're just gonna have to deal with it. And there's real life. So it is what it is. So poor Michelle, she's laughing probably. But Michelle, we were talking about your transition has really been like your husband started off on active army and then he transitioned to the guard and then he did 10 years total. Was that 10 years?
Yeah, 10 years.
Before he was medically eligible for military medically medical retirement. But then you were talking about the challenges that come with the process because everything's in place for people who are retiring after 20 years and not so much in place for people who are retiring at 10 years, right? Can you talk to us a little bit about that and how that fed into your because I imagine that that became your full-time job, managing that transition. So I just wanted to peel back the curtain a little bit because I don't know that everybody understands what it's like to be medically retired versus retired.
Yeah, so it pretty much became like practically another full-time job for me because there's not a lot of resources out there, especially for medical retirement, especially this early. There's plenty for, once you have your 20 years, here's a big booklet, this is what you need to do. But being medically retired at 10 years, it's like, okay, here you go, figure it out yourself. And so it became a lot of time me sitting there doing research, talking to people that I knew were medically retired, and just trying to figure it out. And then to put the kind of the twist into it, with my husband being in the reserves, it's even less information. His whole unit had no idea how to even go through with this. So we were having to tell them, like, this is what we need to do. This is where it is. And kind of the biggest issue we had where we knew that he had all these disabilities because he was 100% disabled as of October 2019. So we have all that, but he needed to be in front of a military doctor in order to get his profile and start the process. Well, the reserves don't really have that. You see, civilian doctors, and civilian doctors aren't wanting to fill out profile paperwork every 60 days, 90 days. And so it became of us making lists and constantly having to research and call around and seeing and trying to find people to work with us.
So that essentially became your full-time job to be the small C caregiver. And we're differentiating between small C caregiver and big C caregiver because Michelle just taught me that VA does provide some service members with big C caregivers if they meet a certain threshold, but family members who may be in a caregiving capacity in a small C manning do not get support from the VA, in which they don't get payment, they don't get other benefits. And thank you for sharing that because I did not know that. But within the scope of your career, it sounds like that would be a full-time job. And I mean, did you even when did you start to come out of that and think, now I'm settled enough to start pursuing a career myself?
Well, it wasn't necessarily come out of it. It was pretty much I had to find a career regardless, pretty much as soon as he got active duty, because it went from, him being primary income giver for the household to me all of a sudden being like, it had to be me. His health got pretty bad for a while and I had no choice but to work. So I'm, working. We have 5 kids. Now 5 kids. At the time we had 4, but now I have 5 kids, and we were sitting there trying to, figure out and make ends meet. And I had no choice but to, wear multiple hats. His health was bad. I was taking care of him. I was working full time, and I was sitting there trying to manage and figure out, how to get him med boarded essentially, or at least somewhere settled.
And then Tell us, I love the journey of about how you found your first job and how, yes, you might have been downsized, but it created the opportunity for your
Mhm.
next job, which is, I feel like you found your niche.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, pretty much, went from corporate HR, and I've held, like most military spouses, I've held the most random jobs in the last 10 years here and there. And I kind of used all those skills. And I was like, all right, well, out of these skills, I like doing this, this, and this. And so I started as a virtual assistant, and then I transitioned into an online business manager and kind of just found my way there using all these random skills that I've earned over the years.
And so we were chatting a little bit about what it is you actually do because you're an
Mhm.
accredited online business manager. But I wonder if you could tell people how you found that certification and what you actually like a day in your life.
Yeah. So I was a virtual assistant for a little bit, but I was offering like very specialized services. I was offering a lot of HR services, and I was reading along with different VA groups and stuff. And someone kept mentioning OBM. And I was like, what is this? Like VA never, the title never really fit me. And I was like, there's something more. And I saw OBM, I started researching it. And I'm just like, oh, I've been being OBM in disguise all this time. Like, what am I doing? And so I started transitioning into that and slowly started transitioning my clients from, VA clients over to the OBM. And so pretty much my life now, it varies daily. Like most clients, I only work with about 20 hours a month, and I time block, and everyone has, there's certain times where I'll work with them, but I could be doing stuff like running full on operations to kind of the behind the scenes where I'm process improvement, SOPs, making things streamlined and automated to where my days vary quite a bit depending on what client and the needs of that day.
So I love talking to you about this because you clearly love it. Like when we were talking about your transition and the caregiving, and then when you started talking about this, being an online business manager versus being a VA virtual assistant, you absolutely glow and you're very enthusiastic about the process. And it's kind of great. And we were talking about how you're now, you stopped to have your baby and now you're starting to ramp up again. And how did you find your way to being a VA first and then OBM? Like, how did you go from, because you're 24/7 caregiving. And then when you have the time and space and breath to even think about what you want to do, is it the luxury of thinking about what you want to do, or was it like, I just need to find something right now and it just happened to fit?
Well, when I was laid off from my corporate job, it was like, okay, I need something right now. I applied to so many jobs, but didn't have that flexibility that I needed for to be able to take care of my husband, take care of our kids. And so I was saying there like, okay, well, how are we going to do this? I have to have remote. I have to have that flexibility. I did some temp jobs, and it just the schedules were not, aligning where I needed it to be. And so it got to the point where like, okay, well, a VA, virtual assistant, I'm like, that is kind of, I'm like, that's a little, something for now. And then as I kind of grew, then it's like, okay, like this is, my, other identity beyond, caregiver and mother. This is something that's for me that I can, dive in and make crazy spreadsheets and organize and do everything that I absolutely love to do. But it's, me, Michelle, instead of, wife, caregiver, mother. This is me.
That's awesome. And it sounds like some of the skills that you brought to helping manage your husband's med board and the
Mhm.
medical retirement kind of serve you well in terms of being an OBM and developing those skills and processes. So that's amazing. And I think we would be wasting an opportunity because you are one of the only veteran spouses we've spoken to if we don't ask you some transition questions, because as a spouse who's already done the transition from the active duty and the reserve lifestyle, any tips for anybody who's going to go through it soon? Like any pitfalls to look out for?
I think the biggest thing, especially now, my husband, his health isn't improving. Right now, we're kind of looking at, his next life. Obviously, he's been out of active duty for about 4 years, and he's only been medically retired for about 2 months. And so we're right at, the transition point of like, okay, what does he want to? Like, what can he do? We know with his disability, it's probably going to have to be remote. And so I think our biggest pitfall is the job market right now is not the best.
Right.
And so he, came out like, "Oh, I can do this, I can do that." But it's very much a reality check. Like, the job market isn't the best right now, especially for transitioning military. Unless you do fellowships or different things like that, it's hard to get your foot in the door. And there's just so much thing that he's having to relearn. He hasn't, worked a job since high school. He has not really dealt with, the civilian world and all the joys of job. He's heard me complain about it plenty, but for him to actually be in it, it's definitely like a reality check. He's just like, oh. And so he's constantly like, well, I kind of wish I was back active duty. Like that was easy. Like I don't know any of this stuff. And so that's been the hardest transition point. Like the pitfall of it is he's clueless and he's like, felt like I was on top of the world. And now reality's kind of, in our faces.
So you were mentioning that he's going through a fellowship?
He is currently going through the Hiring Our Heroes, their Google certificate.
Mhm.
So with that, once he completes that, he'll get offered a fellowship where they'll release his resume and kind of do that. And so that's kind of an easy way to kind of get him, his foot in the door somewhere.
So how about you? Or were there any really good resources that you used as either a caregiver or a military spouse looking for employment? I mean, I know that you were saying that for your husband, it was Hiring Our Heroes and O2O and all that other stuff, but how about
Mhm.
you?
I actually used that first. I used that last year before I transitioned to an OBM to where I did the Hiring Our Heroes. I didn't go into the fellowship because I was pregnant at the time and I couldn't commit the time, but I did what certificate through O2O. I did the Hiring Our Heroes. I did the Hiring Our Heroes Amplify event, which is a 3-day like resources galore event. Did that. And then I actually volunteer now with the Military Spouse Advocacy Network, wherein they have a whole mentorship hub where it's a whole bunch of, military spouses with all different branches and different stages of life. They have, a caregiver advocate that, shares stuff. And there's just a lot of people that, have been where I've been. Maybe not completely because I get asked a lot of questions about, the medically retirement and stuff like that. But they definitely have, a community made for
No, that's
caregivers.
awesome. That's wonderful. And thank you for sharing all those. And so I know we were also chatting about, where you guys are from. And I think you said, and about how we both mentioned that one of the hardest things for anybody when they're separating or retiring from the military is trying to decide where they want to live. And you ask them this question, it's almost like you ask them how they're going to solve world hunger. You're like, no, just tell me where you want to live. And like, that's a tough question. How did you guys decide?
We Anytime we traveled anywhere, we're always like, "Oh, well, could we live here?" Like, we went to Disney World, and we're driving through Florida, and we're like, "Could we live here?" And we played that game for a while, and then we had, South Carolina and Colorado, and then he's originally from Texas, and this is where his daughters live, and so we're kinda like, "Alright, well, let's go ahead and let's do Texas, at least, until the girls graduate." And so that's why we kinda, zeroed on Texas. Texas has great benefits for veterans, especially disabled veterans. And pretty much we decided here, we decided on Austin because it's close enough to Fort Cavazos and San Antonio to where if you want to do anything military, we're right there. But we also have the IT sector here in Austin. So it pretty much, gave him, the world of options of whatever he wanted to do right here.
I love that. And I love the critical thinking you brought through the process. And we also need to point out too that you guys are a little bit younger than most veterans that are going through the transition because you guys are both in your 30s, right? Your early 30s. And
Mhm.
so, you did have to approach it from a career perspective. And I mean, I think everybody does, but you're like school, family, career thing. So I love that. And I guess the other question I want to attach to that is the grass greener on their side? I mean, like, is it better for you guys, for your family specifically? And if you want to speak generically, that's okay too. Is it better like the veteran lifestyle versus the active duty lifestyle? I mean, what are the pros and the cons?
As a family, it's definitely more stable. We like, we own our house, we're able to have a community. We know they're going to be at the same school for, until graduation if we decide to stay here. But it's definitely more stable. So as a family, absolutely, it's a lot greener. For my husband, on a career standpoint, he would go back to active duty in a heartbeat. He misses it. All his friends are still all over the world and he's talking to them at every different time. He's missing it because he loved his career. He hated that it was cut short and everything, so he would go back, but as a family, we are definitely more stable and happier.
Well, I really appreciate your candor and your willingness to share the veteran perspective and
Mhm,
your perspective as a military spouse, I'm a veteran spouse, but also as a caregiver, because I think that's a perspective that unless we're in the community, we don't often hear. So I
mhm.
appreciate you taking the time to do that with us. And I think we've just been all over the place because I think have a lot of lessons to teach us. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to just let me know if there's a question I should have asked or if there's something that maybe you think that people should know.
I think the biggest thing is kind of not necessarily the stigma, but everything surrounding a medical like retirement. My husband sometimes, he'll talk to people and they find out that he's being medically retired. He feels like they treat him differently because he is so young and he is gonna, get some of the benefits, early. But I think the biggest thing is, it's not talked about. There's a lot of people being medically retired, but it's not talked about. There's no resources out there. When he was going through his med board, he was given a big packet of what to do if you were retire, like 20-year retire. And so we were very just lost in it. I think that's the biggest thing. It's just not talked about. And I just wish that like there was more resources built there for different scenarios under the retirement.
And you're such a typical spouse that you made it about your husband.
I
But what
did.
about for you? Like, what about for you? Is there anything that in hindsight that you learned that you wish had existed for you or didn't exist for you?
I think the biggest thing is just to like keep your community, all your friends that you made all throughout, all the different duty stations, just keep with your community because it gets very lonely, especially once you leave, because you feel like you don't fit in. You're like, okay, like, your military spouse, especially a caregiver spouse, there's not a lot in the community unless you're right there next to a base. And so it's just keep in contact with your friends. Like you won't feel as lonely when you're doing the transition if you're still, talking and being a part of everyone's lives. Because a lot of times you want to isolate yourself because you feel like you don't fit, that active duty spouse anymore. But it's definitely important to keep communications and have that community around you.
I love it. And I think that's a great reminder because I think as the military spouse community, I like to think once a spouse, always a spouse, where
Hmm.
like I think that the veteran and retired spouse, the same, but I
Yeah.
think a lot to offer for active spouses because we're the continuity. Like we're in the community and we can
Yeah.
be a bridge for them when they're looking for jobs and don't have the opportunity to network. We have those networks for them. So
Yeah.
I know that you're going to mentor a lot of spouses because you care. So Michelle, thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us. And if you haven't read her highlight, I hope you will. It's on the website, so please go back and read it. And I want to thank our friends at USA for making these conversations possible. It's always a pleasure. And I hope you guys will come back next week and come learn about another fantastic military spouse. But Michelle, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you.
Bye, guys.